Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this special episode of Andy Oakley Investigates, and I'm Andy Oakley. Today we're diving into a critical issue facing New Zealand as we reflect on Budget 2025. Our government, led by Prime Minister Chris Luxon and Finance Minister Nicola Willis, is obsessed with getting the budget back to surplus by 2028 or 2029. Groups like the Taxpayers Union and other political parties too are cheering them on, warning about a debt clock ticking to 190 billion. But here's the thing, they're all looking at our economy through the wrong lens, and it's costing us big time, hurting our productivity, our infrastructure, and so our future. One thing's for sure, since Don Brash's time as Governor of the Reserve Bank and the introduction of the Public Finance Act in 1989, which in clause 26G encourages governments to balance the books, productivity, home ownership, and the general wealth of people has nosedived. That's 36 years of financial mismanagement at a macro level, a total inability to understand what they are doing wrong. Today, I'm going to show you why this fear of debt is misguided using a framework called modern monetary theory, or MMT, which is championed by economists such as Warren Mosler, Stephanie Kelton, Bill Williams, and many others. We'll unpack what debt really is, how it can fuel growth, and why slashing spending to balance the books is fiscally outrageous. By the end, you'll know why we need to lobby our government to rethink their approach, and I'll give you practical steps to make your voices heard. So grab a coffee and let's get started. The debt myth. What's really going on? You've probably heard Luxon and Willis talk about New Zealand's debt like it's a ticking time bomb. As of June 2024, our net core crown debt was 175.5 billion, or 42.5% of GDP, up 20 billion from the previous year. The Taxpayers Union says this is 93,500 per household, and they want it reversed by 2028. Sounds scary, right? But let's take a step back. New Zealand has a fiat currency, the New Zealand dollar, which we control. Unlike a household, our government can't run out of money. It creates New Zealand dollars whenever it spends. MMT tells us that government debt isn't like your credit card bill. It's the sum of all of the money the government has spent into the economy that hasn't been taxed back. That 175.5 billion, it's not money we owe to someone who can demand it back. It's money sitting in bank accounts, bonds, and businesses, which is fueling our economy. So in effect, any effort to reduce the debt, if successful, will shrink the economy. And when the government issues bonds, it's just swapping one form of money, cash, for another, interest-bearing bonds. Foreigners hold about 50% of those bonds, but they can't force us to default because we pay in New Zealand dollars, which we can always create. So why are Luxon and Willis so worried? They're stuck in a neoclassical mindset, treating the government like a household, or in Luxon and Willis's case, a corporation that needs to pay back its debt. This lens ignores that cutting spending to reduce debt takes money out of our pockets, and so slowing growth. In 2024, the government's operating balance was slashed to 1.3 billion from 2.4 billion, one of the tightest budgets in a decade. So that's less money for hospitals, schools, and infrastructure, things that we desperately need. Here's economics professor Stephanie Kelton explaining what the US government debt is. It's real data, and New Zealand operates a fiat currency in exactly the same way as the US.
So here's a graph from a Congressional Budget Office report. It shows you exactly how it works in the real world. The government in this case spent about $6.3 trillion into our hands on all those different programs you see up there. And then they taxed away from us about $4.4 trillion. If they're crediting and debiting accounts and they're adding more than they're subtracting, what do the rest of us get left with? A surplus of about $1.9 trillion. We call it a deficit because we're only looking at it from the perspective of the government's budget. But if we look at it from the perspective of the non-government part of the economy, that's our financial surplus to the penny. Okay, where did it come from? It came from the fact that the government is doing that. That bleeding of red ink that everybody worries about. Oh my God, why are they mismanaging their finances? Why can't they get it together and balance the budget? That sea of red ink is so troubling. Is it? Is it really? Flip it around. If you flip it around, what do you see? You see the financial surplus that is accumulating in the private sector. This is the private sector. This is where we all live. These are the households and the businesses in the US economy. And they're in surplus because of the government's deficits. If you put the whole picture together and you bring in the rest of the world and this is real data, okay, I didn't make this up. The government deficit is what is allowing the rest of the economy to achieve a surplus.
So on the one hand, we see world-renowned economists such as Stephanie Kelton explaining to the world how government deficits fuel growth in the private sector. And on the other, we have a Minister of Finance, Nicola Willis, with no formal qualifications at all in economics, telling the people of New Zealand that she thinks the government are like a household or a business, and it must earn revenue from somewhere before it can spend into the economy.
I always have to worry about it too because I'm the bean counter in the government, and less growth means less revenue. Less revenue makes it harder for me to balance the books and make all the investments that we need to make as a country.
Luxon, Willis, and almost all economists who are taught economics from institutions that teach neoclassical economics believe the best way to raise money so the books can be balanced is through taxing people and businesses, particularly exporters, which is why you hear them talking about growth through exporting.
Okay, stay with me. Here's a key way we're helping with the cost of living. I can't overstate how important trade and investment is to New Zealand's economic growth, and that's why both Todd McClay as our Trade Minister and myself are throwing ourselves at doing business all around the world. We've got three key updates for you today. The first is, it's been 1 year since our free trade agreement with the EU kicked in, and it's really working. Our exports are up nearly $1 billion. Sheep meat, fruit, machinery, all are surging and pumping. And get this, our kiwi fruit growers actually pulled in an extra $316 million thanks to the early access that we were able to get that agreement up and running much faster. That's a big win for economic growth here in New Zealand. Second, exciting news, we're actually kicking off our first in-person trade talks with India this week, and with a $4.3 trillion economy and 1.4 billion people, as we all know, there is massive potential here for our Kiwi exporters. And finally, thirdly, to the Gulf states, we just hosted Saudi Arabia's agriculture minister and 37 delegates, and we're getting ready also to sign a major deal with the Gulf states that will give duty-free access for 99% of our exports. Now, this all proves we're doing the business around the world to grow our economy here at home. And that is one of the biggest ways that we can lift our wages, create more jobs, and put more money in your back pocket to help you with the cost of living, which is our number one priority.
This exporting economic strategy is flawed to its core. Luxon believes that economic growth comes from allowing large multinational companies to utilise New Zealand workers and the majority of our productive land to produce goods and services for foreign countries. In his mind, because he wrongly believes that the government gets its revenue through taxing, as he taxes these huge wealthy companies sending our goods and services overseas, it will be a tax windfall for the government, who then can pay for whatever it is they want to create in New Zealand. However, they don't understand how government monetary operations work, and this is where MMT comes in. It does explain how government monetary operations actually work now. Tax is not required for the government to spend. They can create money at will, just as they did during COVID. Tax is not revenue. Tax is the coercive force that encourages people to go to work in the first place. So first, the government sets a tax liability, and then the government spends, issuing currency into the economy for productive purposes, calling for tenders and awarding contracts as required. The people and businesses who must pay taxes are employed by the companies building the infrastructure, and this is how currency flows into the economy. Once the tax liability has been paid to the government by the people or businesses, the money is destroyed, or rather, the coercive tax liability is returned to zero, simply by altering digits on a computer screen. There are no vaults for dollar coins, and there are no spreadsheets with spare digits sitting about. Every dollar the government spends is a new dollar. Because Luxon and Willis and their economic advisors don't understand this relatively simple economic fact, we have a $200 billion a year shortfall in infrastructure, along with low productivity and unacceptable unemployment. And it's about to get worse, because exporting all of our goods and services to China and India is not required at all for growth.
The last government effectively left the kitty bare, worse than that, in serious overdraft. And New Zealand is now running out of credit cards.
You see, Willis and Luxon blame Labour for the debt levels and believe that, just like a household, they must use credit cards to pay our debt. Now, this is a gross misunderstanding of how government monetary operations actually work. The government are legally the sole issuer of the New Zealand dollar. They do not have credit cards, and they do not owe foreign entities any money. The cost of austerity, New Zealand's productivity crisis. Let's talk about what this debt phobia is doing to New Zealand. Our productivity growth has been stagnant, averaging just 1% per year since the year 2000, compared to double that, 2% for other OECD countries. Why? Because we're not investing enough. There's a $200 billion infrastructure shortfall. Roads, rail, housing, water systems, all crumbling or non-existent. Auckland's traffic congestion alone costs $1.3 billion a year in lost time. And housing prices have soared 50% in a decade, locking out young Kiwis. The government knows this, but refuses to spend because they're scared of debt. Budget 2025 cut $5.9 million in spending, redirecting some to tax cuts, but left only $707 million uncommitted for 2025. And that's nowhere near enough to fix our infrastructure or boost productivity. The Treasury's own forecasts show that net core ground debt rising to $192.8 billion by June 2025. Yet Willis insists on a surplus by 2028 or 2029, delaying it from earlier promises of 2027. This obsession with balancing the books is starving our economy. Here's where MMT comes in. It says the real limit isn't debt, but our economy's capacity. Workers, materials, factories. Right now, we have spare capacity. In 2024, there were 149,800 people out of work. There were 13,000 less construction workers than the year prior, with a further 385,000 people reported as being underutilised. That is, they would work more hours if it was available. Many of these people could be building roads, houses, or renewable energy plants. MMT says the government can create money to employ these resources, boosting output without inflation. Instead, Luxon's team is cutting spending, which takes money out of pockets and slows growth. Look at the 2020-2021 COVID response. Whatever you think about it, the RBNZ, or the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, created $100 billion through quantitative easing, funding deficits without crashing the economy. Inflation stayed low because the economy had slack. And compare that to 2022, when inflation hit 7.3%, which was driven by a global supply shock. Oil, food, shipping, not government spending. MMT teaches us to spend wisely, matching resources, not to slash budgets out of fear. What debt really is? I think it's a tool for growth. So what is this debt everybody's freaking out about? MMT says it's just the money government has spent that hasn't been taxed back. That 175 billion in 2024 is the net New Zealand dollars in our economy, held as bonds, bank deposits or cash. It's not a burden. It's a record of investment, just as Stephanie Kelton showed us earlier on with her graph. When the government spends on infrastructure, it creates jobs, businesses thrive and the economy grows. Taxes then fine-tune demand to prevent inflation. The neoclassical view, Luxon and Willis's view, sees debt as a liability to be repaid, especially since foreigners own 50% of our bonds. But those foreigners can't bankrupt us. We pay them in New Zealand dollars, which we create. The real risk isn't default. It's if they sell bonds, raising yields and borrowing costs. In 2022, yields on 10-year bonds jumped from 1.5% to 4.8% when investors got nervous, adding about 300 million a year to debt servicing. But that's a market reaction, not a necessity. If we did away with the bond market altogether, that is, if we issued money instead of bonds, we could avoid those interest costs. That would have been a saving of 6.7 billion in 2024, allowing us further investment. MMT doesn't say print money recklessly. It says spend up to the economy's capacity. New Zealand's construction sector is crying out for work. There's a huge number of skilled but idle workers who could build homes or fix roads. The $200 billion infrastructure gap could be closed by issuing money for tenders, phased to match resources. Inflation? Only if we overdo it. Right now, inflation is at 3.5% in Q1 of 2025, well within the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's 1 to 3% target. We do have room to act. Why Budget 2025 should have been a turning point? The Budget 2025 was a make or break. Willis has signalled it'll be tight with just 1.3 billion in new spending, prioritising health, education and defence. The Greens and the taxpayers' unions are pushing for even harsher cuts, saying debt's out of control. But here's the insanity. Cutting spending to hit a surplus by 2028, 2029 actually shrinks the economy. Less government spending means fewer jobs, less business revenue and less money in your pocket. The Treasury's own data shows GDP growth at just 1.4% in 2025, barely recovering from a 4.6% per capita recession since 2022. If we follow MMT, Budget 2025 could have been a game changer. Instead of austerity, the government could have issued 10 billion a year for infrastructure, hiring those idle construction workers and training more. Focus on high return projects like rail or renewable energy, boosting productivity. Doing away with regressive GST altogether, and instead monitor inflation and use taxes like a luxury goods tax, for instance, to cool demand if prices are high. Now, this isn't fantasy. During COVID, our government's QE funded deficits without disaster. Other countries like Japan creates money without runaway inflation. Japan's inflation was 3.6% in March 2025, despite massive QE. Now, New Zealand's smaller, but our fiat currency gives us the same power. The real risk is doing nothing, letting our infrastructure crumble and productivity stagnate. Okay, so here's a call to action. Let's change the narrative. Kiwis, it's time to act. Luxon, Willis and the taxpayer union are stuck in the 1980s mindset, treating debt like a sin. But MMT shows us debt is just the money we've invested in ourselves. Cutting spending to hit a surplus won't make us richer. We're not like a household. It'll make us poorer. We need budgets to prioritise growth, not austerity. And here's what you can do. Contact your MP, email or call your local, tell them to read Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth. I know Winston Peters has, and push for MMT informed policies. Demand investment in infrastructure over surplus obsession. Spread the word, share this podcast on social media with MMT for New Zealand. Explain to friends why debt isn't the enemy, growth is. Join the hikoi. Well, the Taxpayers Union mentioned a hikoi to balance the budget, but let's start our own movement. Organise local meetups to discuss MMT and lobby for change. Write to Willis, send a letter to Finance Minister Nicola Willis at Parliament, urging her to fund infrastructure by issuing money, not bonds, highlighting the 13,000 idle construction workers and a $200 billion infrastructure gap. We have a window to shift the narrative between now and the 2026 budget. The IMF's 2025 report says New Zealand's growth will hit 2.7% by 2026 if we invest now. Let's make budget 2026 the growth budget Luxon claims it is, but through MMT, not cuts. Together we can build a stronger, more productive New Zealand. And thanks for everyone listening. Please subscribe, leave a comment, share this episode, and let's get New Zealand back on track again.